Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll make that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated as we record the program. We will, of course, post our program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference, and Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Mr. Lohman also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he leads a graduate seminar on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia. He has served as a senior professional Republican staff member for both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as well as a policy aide to Senator John McCain on trade, defense, and foreign policy issues. Prior to joining us here, he served as both the country director for the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, looking into the American interest in Indonesia and Singapore, before he served for 4 years as senior vice president and executive director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Walter Lohman. Walter?
Okay, thanks, John. Well, thank you all for coming out today. This is actually a program we've had in the works for some time. You know, it's a sort of modest scope here, but you'd be amazed at how hard it is to coordinate schedules of people who are very much in demand for their expertise on this issue. So I'm really glad we're doing it. And it turns out the timing couldn't be better, given the president's trip to Asia and some of the things that he had to say and the White House has had to say about U.S.-Japan cooperation in Southeast Asia. I have to say I was pleasantly surprised by the joint statement, the references to Southeast Asia, but then especially this fact sheet that the White House put out. It was a role and sort of a prominence for cooperation there that I have not seen. And I've gone back and looked at statements from the president's previous trips. I think that's a very welcome development. And now I think the real task is how to operationalize some of that cooperation, and or just learn better how the synergies work and what we're doing together in the region. We've got a eminently qualified panel here to help us work through what those implications are, what our shared interests are, et cetera. I'm particularly pleased and honored to have Shigeo Yamada here from the Japanese Embassy. He's a political minister there. He's been with the Embassy of Japan since 2012. Before that, he was 3 years in Beijing. Also had assignments at MOFA as director of the Northeast Asia Division and director of the second Southeast Asia Division. So he's got the whole portfolio there of issues and connections to this particular area. Satu Lemay is then going to follow him. Satu is an old friend of mine in a couple different iterations. But Satu is director of the East-West Center here in Washington and director of Asia Matters for America initiative. He's been there in those capacities since 2007. I think maybe Asia Matters is a little bit more recent than 2007. Yeah. But if you haven't seen some of that work, it's great. It's great work trying to get out into the country and show people a little bit what Asia's about and why they ought to care about the U.S. position in the Pacific mostly. Satu was at IDA before that, Institute of Defense Analysis. He also worked for several years, 8 years actually, at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies out in Honolulu. I don't know what possessed you to leave Honolulu for Washington.
For my sins, Walter, for my sins.
I wish we could have traded places at that time. If you had just asked, I would have gladly traded places. But the Asia Pacific Center is a DoD think tank, basically. And Satu was Director of Research and Publications there. So he came to this current job very highly qualified. Satu also has a PhD in International Relations from Oxford and an undergrad degree from Georgetown. And then Yuki Tatsumi. Yuki is also a longtime friend of mine. She's been in Washington a long time. Maybe at this point you spend more of your career in Washington than Tokyo, is it?
Actually, all.
Oh, all, okay, yeah. So she understands well both sides. She helps bridge bridge the gap on understanding, plays a great role in that in Washington. But she's a senior associate at the Stimson Center. She's been there since 2004. Before that, she was at CSIS and the Japanese Embassy. She's very widely published and respected in her field here. She has a master's degree in international economic and Asian studies from SAIS and an undergrad degree from Christian University in Tokyo. So with that, let me turn it over to Yamada-san. He can start us off, and then we'll go just through the panel and hopefully have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Should I go there or
What would you prefer?
either way?
We'll just do that.
Okay. Thank you, Walter. And it's my great pleasure to be here today with my friends Yuki and Satu to talk about U.S.-Japan cooperation in Southeast Asia. As you pointed out, it's a very timely meeting. The President Obama spent a couple of days in Japan for a very successful visit. And it was a state visit, and I cannot really believe that President Obama is the first American president to visit Japan as a state guest in 18 years. And so the meeting was very productive, substantive, but also this visit as a state guest served to symbolize the close relationship between our two countries. And as Walter, you pointed out, especially from our point of view, this president's visit was very significant because one of the major focuses of the visit was Japan-US cooperation on Southeast Asia. I would say our two governments worked very hard to make your event a very timely event.
That's great. Thank you for that.
So overall theme for the president's visit to Asia this time is to confirm the administration's commitment to this Asia rebalancing policy, to declare that the United States remains to be a Pacific nation. Yes, through this visit, Japan was reassured. The joint statement issued today, which was titled the United States and Japan, Shaping the Future of the Asia-Pacific and Beyond. This joint statement had a very clear message to the people of Japan, as well as to the region, that the United States is committed to the Japan-US alliance and to the Asia-Pacific region. But in addition to that confirmation of US commitment, the other message, and I think this is a more important message, we wanted to send from Tokyo was that Japan has been and will continue to be the reliable partner of the United States as the United States rebalances to the Asia-Pacific region. This message was clear in the first paragraph of that joint statement I just talked about, which reads, the United States rebalance to the Asia-Pacific and Japan's policy of proactive contribution to peace based on the principle of international cooperation. These both policies contribute to the alliance playing a leading role in ensuring a peaceful and prosperous Asia-Pacific. Joint statement also has one paragraph dedicated to our relationship with ASEAN countries and stated that United States and Japan renew our commitment to deepening diplomatic, economic, and security cooperation with ASEAN. The two leaders also issued a fact sheet, as Walter noticed, on Japan-US global and regional cooperation. The first pillar of such cooperation was cooperating together with Southeast Asia. So what is the peaceful and prosperous Asia-Pacific the two countries envision? The two leaders made clear in their meeting as well as in the joint statement that we will play a leading role in ensuring a peaceful and prosperous Asia-Pacific, especially Southeast Asia, which shares a common vision for a rules-based international order, a commitment to upholding democratic values and promoting open markets. That is exactly the vision, the United States rebalancing policy, vision of the US rebalancing policy, and Japan fully shares that vision. Hence, Japan is the natural and reliable partner of the United States. In Asia, most of the countries welcome US presence and rebalancing policy. But at the same time, there are often voices here in Washington and also in Asia, asking whether the Obama administration can deliver its Asia rebalancing policy. Many commentators in Asia ask what America will do for us with this rebalancing policy. However, however, it is we, the Asian countries, who want to see US commitment to the region. And if that is the case, then the question we should be asking is not what America will do for us with this policy, but rather what together we can do for the peace, stability, and prosperity of the Asia-Pacific region. And Prime Minister Abe is fully ready to be a full partner of the United States in this endeavor, and yesterday's meeting between the two leaders was a strong demonstration of that commitment. Then what is the Prime Minister Abe's Southeast Asia policy? There are much talk about Japan's first ever national security strategy that was issued at the end of last year. Let us look at that national security strategy and see how Abe administration writes about Southeast Asia. The main part of the national security strategy is titled Japan's Strategic Approaches to National Security. They talk about 6 approaches. The first approach is strengthening and expanding Japanese capabilities and roles. And the second is strengthening the alliance between Japan and the United States. The third of those approaches, the national security strategy, talks about strengthening diplomacy and security cooperation with Japan's partners for peace and stability in the international community. So which countries are the partners in this approach? The national security strategy first mentions the Republic of Korea. The second partner is Australia. These are the 2 countries, Japan and the United States, have conducted robust trilateral cooperation, including trilateral summit meetings. But following these 2 countries, the national security strategy mentions ASEAN. By the way, the 4th is another important regional partner, India. So this list indicates how much importance the Abe administration places on Japan's relationship with ASEAN countries. The national security strategy points out that the ASEAN countries are located in the critical areas of sea lanes of communications for Japan. From this point of view, the situation in the South China Sea has a direct impact to Japan. And as the strategic environment changes in the Asia-Pacific, importance of ASEAN increases. Apart from this strategic location, economic relations between Japan and ASEAN are vital for each other's prosperity. Japan and ASEAN are each other's 2nd largest trading partners. Every year, we see more than $10 billion of Japanese direct investment going into Southeast Asian countries. That is way more than Japanese direct investment to China. In fact, during the first half of 2013, Japanese direct investment to ASEAN was double the size of Japanese investment to China. And more than 7,000 Japanese companies operate in ASEAN countries. So against this backdrop, Prime Minister Abe invested his time and energy in solidifying Japan's relationship with ASEAN countries. His first trip after he became the Prime Minister was to Southeast Asia. He has made 5 trips to ASEAN countries and visited all 10 countries during his first year in office. And last December, Prime Minister Abe hosted a Japan-ASEAN commemorative summit in Tokyo to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Japan-ASEAN relationship. But some people in Washington or in the United States or the international community may ask, is Japan a good partner for the United States in its Southeast Asia diplomacy? Doesn't Japan have a historical baggage which might undermine US efforts in the region? The answer shouldn't come from me, it should come from the people in Southeast Asia. So let me share with you the result of an opinion poll conducted in 7 of the ASEAN countries last month. They were asked which country is the most reliable among the 10 countries, including the United States, China, Japan, ROK, Australia, New Zealand, India, the UK, France, and Germany. Surprisingly or not, Japan topped the list with 33%. The United States came in second with 16%, then the United Kingdom with 6%. Australia and China each got 5%. They were also asked whether Japanese security policy based on the proactive contribution to peace is helpful for the region or not. 90% of the respondents said yes. So the Abe administration not only has the commitment to working together with the United States in promoting the goals of US rebalancing policy, the Abe administration has done the homework of consolidating its relationship with ASEAN countries. And the ASEAN countries now look to Japan and the United States as the 2 leading reliable partners. The ground is ready for concrete Japan-US cooperation in Southeast Asia. So what are the areas Japan and the United States can work together? The fact sheet I mentioned, which was issued today, provides us with the current ideas of the 2 governments. First area is regional mechanisms. The East Asia Summit, to which we welcomed the United States as an official member in 2011, should be the leading forum in the region, especially to discuss political and security issues. We should work together to encourage ASEAN countries to talk about difficult issues at the East Asia Summit. We should also voice our strong support for ASEAN countries at the East Asia Summit meetings. ARF and ADMM Plus, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, are the other fora our 2 countries participate together. By the way, in this regard, the 2 leaders agreed on the importance of supporting this year's ASEAN chair, Myanmar. ODA is clearly an area in which coordination between 2 countries can make our respective efforts more productive and more efficient. This year is the 60th anniversary of Japan's ODA programs. Japan has provided more than $300 billion to 190 countries and regions. And traditionally, Japan's ODA had been focused on Asia. On the aggregate basis, Indonesia is the biggest recipient of Japanese ODA. The Philippines is the 4th, after China and India. On top of these already committed and provided ODA, at the commemorative summit last December, Japan announced additional $20 billion of ODA to ASEAN countries during the next 5 years. In order to better coordinate our development assistance, Japan and the United States recently launched a senior-level development dialogue. In the first meeting held in February this year, here in Washington, Southeast Asia was one of the priority areas for coordination. With regard to this assistance coordination, one area we are taking concrete steps is to coordinate our capacity building assistance to ASEAN countries in the field of maritime safety and security. In this area, Japan has provided 3 patrol vessels to Indonesia in 2006. Japan last year agreed to provide a yen loan for 10 patrol vessels to the Philippines. Most recently, Japan and Vietnam are in consultation for possible provision of patrol vessels. For maritime safety and security, Japan and the United States can encourage ASEAN countries to work together to strengthen rules and principles based on international law. The joint statement supported the ASEAN's efforts for early establishment of an effective code of conduct. And the joint statement also made clear our full support for the use of diplomatic and legal means, including international arbitration, to settle maritime disputes. HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, is also a priority area for our countries to cooperate. At the commemorative summit last December, Japan announced that additional $3 billion will be provided to ASEAN in the field of strengthening their disaster management cooperation. Recent Typhoon Haiyan was a very sad disaster, but Japan and the United States worked together in helping the people of the Philippines. The President Obama will start the Southeast Asia part of his trip tomorrow. I hope his trip will strongly demonstrate U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia, which is based on rules of law, democracy, and market-oriented economy. Strong U.S. commitment to the region is indispensable for Japan and the region, and Japan is committed to working together with the United States as it rebalances to the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Satu?
Great. Well, thank you very much to Walter Lohman and Heritage Foundation for this opportunity to participate in this discussion. Yamada-san for his terrific remarks. I was in a little bit of a dilemma as to what to do since he covered, obviously, some of the areas. So I'm going to just take one section out, and I quickly penned a couple of comments I thought I'd add based on the comments. Walter asked me to speak primarily to the issue of the U.S.-Japan framework for this, and Yamada-san covered it. So I thought I'd step back a little bit and talk about three big things, I think. One is the context within which this cooperation is occurring. The second sort of big themes that I see happening in the region. The second is looking at the ways in which U.S.-Japan coordination in the Southeast Asia has occurred in the post-45 era, because I think it's very important, some of the themes that come out. And then I think it is important to touch on a couple of areas of constraint or challenge as we go forward. And I should preface this by saying that the East-West Center, in cooperation with the Japan Institute of International Affairs and funded by the Sasagawa Foundation, is involved in a multi-year effort called the U.S.-Japan Alliance in Southeast Asia. And some of my comments reflect a process of dialogue very much going on. And that dialogue is important not only in the research sense to get some policy ideas of what we can and can't do, but it has two other functions that I think are very important and very different from the preceding era of U.S.-Japan cooperation on Southeast Asia. Is we have a very different Southeast Asia today than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Very different. Democratic, emerging, growing, multiple partners, etc. And so the dialogue has the added benefit of testing some U.S. and Japanese ideas in the Southeast Asian context. Because we say Southeast Asia, but obviously there are 10 countries. This is not a unanimous or uniform set of players. And the second thing it does is the U.S.-Japan Alliance has wonderful discussions and close coordination and sharing of thoughts on China and our Korean Peninsula and many other issues. Southeast Asia comparatively, not been zero, but comparatively less where Southeast Asians, Americans, and Japanese get together in one place. Is it comparatively new? So what is the context? I think there are four things from my perspective. One is there is a great struggle afoot in Asia. And that struggle is built around what I call the three balances. About the balance of power, about the balance of order, which is norms, rules, values, institutions, and the balance of relations. And I'll be very blunt about it. Walter knows I'm unfortunately too blunt sometimes. America has many advantages in all of these balances, if used properly, harnessed properly. We have the ability to fare very well on all of these balances. The second point I'd make about these balances is that Japan is a critical part of making those advantages work. It's my judgment or my assessment, we cannot do it without Japan. Absent a strong U.S.-Japan relationship, it will be very difficult to harness the advantages that the U.S. does have in the balance of power, the balance of order, and the balance of relations. And this plays out on Southeast Asia. Mindful of the time. Second is PRC assertiveness. We won't go into details here. I think analytically we can say that there are lots of things that lots of countries can do better about them. But it is very clear that PRC assertiveness and the flimsiness of many of the claims is a driver both for the region and for others. The second is the U.S. rebalance, and as Yamada-san mentioned, doubts about this rebalance. I'm old enough to remember that these doubts come and go. And so therefore I tend to be comparatively very optimistic. We've had these waves of doubt about U.S. commitment, doubt about U.S. engagement. I have remained to be convinced that this is somehow fundamentally or structurally different from earlier eras. And the fourth is that Japan too is at a critical juncture. I think a very different juncture. And its decisions on economic revitalization, its decisions on how it wants to frame its security and foreign policy, everything from relaxation of export controls on arms to what it wants to do on collective self-defense, to what it wants to do in terms of activities with neighbors and friends, is at a critical juncture. So for me, these four elements constitute the context within which U.S., Japan, Southeast Asia cooperation can occur. Let me talk about a little about the past. It's not a history lesson. We've been here before. Roughly, there are four patterns. U.S.-Japan engaged in Southeast Asia after 1945 in order to deal with the Cold War and in some sense divert Japan away from China to Southeast Asia for redevelopment after 1945. That's one era in which we worked together, or sort of in parallel, if you will. The second was in the 1970s, post-75, when there was concern again about the U.S. leaving the region, post-Guam Doctrine, Nixon Doctrine, however you want to frame it, and considerable Japanese concerns about the U.S. being present, and therefore a boom in Japanese activities in Southeast Asia, Fukuda Doctrine, et cetera, et cetera. The 80s and 90s were a period post-Plaza Accords of Japanese heavy economic role in developing the liftoff of key Southeast Asian economies because of the high yen and its trade and investment and trading patterns. And in the 1990s, if I may say, and this is a very crude way of putting it, both U.S. and Japan were seen as somewhat disengaged or removed from the region for a period. We weren't, of course, on the ground and doing things diplomatic. But in general, the region saw us, and I think compared to other periods. Why is these four elements important? It's important because I think some of the themes that we're facing today are coming back. We have to deal with Southeast Asia in terms of China. We have to deal with Southeast Asia in terms of keeping the U.S.-Japan relationship engaged, sharing burdens, if you will, enabling alliances, if you will. So we can come back to the discussion. Let me say something about constraints, not to be, if you will, to in any way cast doubt on what I think is of fundamental importance, which is that U.S. and Japan cooperate along many of the lines that have been laid out in the fact sheet. And we can talk about specific things, HADR and economic development and ADMM+, and those are all very important and critical. But I think some constraints, and here maybe I'm channeling my inner Southeast Asian. So let me try to lay out some concerns. One is that the robustness of the U.S. and Japanese domestic economies and commitment to play an external role will be very carefully watched by Southeast Asia. And again, I don't want to overstate this, but a failure of Japan to economically revitalize through Abenomics or whatever else policy prescriptions that follow, the U.S. inability to get back our economy, and I think there's considerable evidence that the U.S. economy is starting to slowly, come back towards a growth pattern, is starting point one for Southeast Asia. At the end of the day, the supply and production network, which has its hubs and spokes throughout Southeast Asia, both from the U.S., from China, from Japan, has as its end state demand places the U.S. and Japan and Europe. So those are important for that. The second thing is a very strong and cooperative U.S.-Japan relationship without too many differences is critical for Southeast Asia. They watch our alliance. And when there were some discrepancies in, say, call it around 2008, 2009, when there was a different government in Japan, and there were some very serious tensions, it mattered quite a lot for our friends in Southeast Asia who said, now wait a minute, if these two critical allies in the region are having these problems, how are we going to be able to work with them? We're too small to get involved and have any leverage. And I very much take Mr. Yamada's point about the historical polling data. It's quite interesting. I've been sent this poll by friends in Tokyo. But I don't know that it's so much the historical controversies directly in Southeast Asia that concern Southeast Asians, but the spillover of the impact of historical controversies in the U.S.-Japan relationship and with Northeast Asian neighbors that then spill over into Southeast Asia. That's slightly indirect, but important for our Southeast Asian friends. Just as they don't want to, quote, choose between the U.S. and China, nor do they want to have on top of very, difficult context within Southeast Asia itself, additional layers of suspicion or contestation. In other words, the way I always put it is, Southeast Asia wants a lot of internationalization. They want everyone involved, EU, Australia, Korea, India, Japan, China, because it helps their development and growth. But they don't want so much internationalization that it becomes strategic exposure that weakens their coherence through contestation. So I think we should be wary of that. The fourth kind of constraint just to keep in mind is that the critical issue and maritime capacity, dealing with South China Sea, all of that is vital. But Southeast Asia is on the cusp of several domestic changes and difficulties in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And economic development and managing inequality in Southeast Asia will be critical to long-term stability. And that means ASEAN integration and coherence and political stability. And how the U.S. and Japan can assist with things like transnational issues, ASEAN integration, creating a coherent ASEAN body, will be an important part of our overall effort. And many of the things in the fact sheet speak to that. And the final thing is something Walter said, and we were discussing a little bit before we came in. There's so much shared will in both Washington and Tokyo to cooperate, and actually shared interests, which makes it wonderful. Operationalizing these cooperation in a very concrete way is a challenge. Simply, again, it's not will, it's not interests, it's not shared values. It's how do you take our bureaucratic system, Japanese bureaucratic system, how do you take the authorities and the funding streams, how do you match them up? Which leads me to one thought that I think is worth mentioning in the context that I started out with. We might want to think about doing things in parallel rather than jointly. And we both have comparative advantages in areas. And sometimes in a very strong alliance like the U.S.-Japan alliance, there may be some more room for Japan to do things without absolutely being joint project with the U.S. And I think that's an important kind of mechanism to think about. Otherwise, we're going to end up trying to create. Having a senior dialogue on development is obviously critical. But I think we know from previous experiences of this that our aid systems are different. They operate differently, they work differently, it's a little challenging to get that. Not that we should stop trying to fix those challenges, but we should also think about where our comparative advantages to our goals our shared goals in Southeast Asia are. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Setu. Yuki.
Thank you, Walter. Good morning. Thanks again for the Heritage Foundation to give me this opportunity. Very humbling to share a panel with Yamada-san and Satu. As many of you in this room know, I am not exactly a South Asian affairs expert per se. So just one disclaimer is that my remarks this morning will be based upon my perspective as the longtime observer of the U.S.-Japan alliance and how the conversation within the alliance structure has evolved over the years. So the homework that Walter gave me this morning was to discuss the feasibility of cooperation and also discuss the potential limiting factors. So Satu has already touched upon many of the talking points that I wrote up. So I hope my remarks will be some add value to that. And then also my discussion of limitation, Satu was channeling his Southeast Asian. I'm channeling in my skepticism about the multilateral framework. So my discussion about limitation is coming in from a little bit different angle. So obviously, feasibility of the cooperation. In short, to sum it up, I think my assessment of the feasibility is, well, it should be feasible. Why not? U.S.-Japan share an interest in ensuring the Asia-Pacific region security environment to be stable and economically prosperous and predictable, so that it provides stability and a secure foundation for the region's continuing economic growth and prosperity. And in this context, I think engagement for both countries with ASEAN is critical. And the fact sheet that Yamada-san talked in detail about this morning really lays out how the past engagement of U.S. and Japan separately with the ASEAN has evolved in a different realm, and how that progressed over time, and how much of a potential that it's still left in this engagement. And in particular, more than anything else, U.S. and Japan does share an interest in making sure that the overall security environment that supports that regional order in the region will not be disrupted by unilateral effort to change the status quo by physical force by any party. And that these basic shared interests are, I think, first time it was articulated, Satu and I were talking about this before we came in this morning, was this shared interests are first articulated, we believe that it was first articulated in the 2+2, U.S.-Japan 2+2 joint statement in October 2013. Mm. And until then, there was really not an extensive discussion about the significance of the Southeast Asia for the alliance per se. Obviously, Southeast Asia on its own has had a place in the higher diplomatic priority for Japan, as Minister Yamada elaborated, and then also for the United States. But together as an alliance, I think this was really the first rendition that we saw in the going into detail of articulation of why this region is important for the alliance. And if I can touch upon a little bit about from Japanese perspective, moving forward, based on what Minister Yamada really elegantly elaborated, I think Japan's engagement with ASEAN will be supported with basically three pillars. Diplomatic engagement is one, capacity building is the second, and strategic use of ODA is the third, so economic engagement. And the diplomatic engagement point, what is crucial for Japan is to support ASEAN in the way that the region can move toward the establishing a rule-based mechanism to manage tensions and manage crisis, or potential crisis, and prevent it from escalation. And as President Obama and Prime Minister Abe said in their joint press conference yesterday, it is very important that the difference of a sovereignty issue, regardless whether it's South China Sea or East China Sea, is resolved peacefully and in a way that respects established international norms, such as the freedom of navigation and the rule of law. So in this context, I think that U.S. and Japan can work together or coordinate each other's diplomatic engagement with ASEAN together to assist ASEAN to take steps to really concrete step to establish and implement the code of conduct for South China Sea on the diplomatic front. And various venues can be used for this kind of engagement. East Asia Summit is certainly one, ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM+. Those are all very useful forums to be instrumental to promote this dialogue. Secondly, when it comes to the capacity building, U.S. and Japan again also coordinate their approaches to capacity building in this Southeast Asia. In particular, what I would like to highlight is the capacity to deal with the humanitarian disaster and large-scale natural disaster. Each ASEAN country's capability and capacity that is required to deal this type of tragedy, including decision-making systems in the government, how does a command structure might look like, and actually physical capacity of the responders, both military and non-military, are actually all the skills that are quite applicable to other types of national emergencies and other efforts to defend their own sovereignty or territorial integrity in certain cases. And currently, U.S. and Japan, as Satu mentioned, have its own separate ASEAN engagement nicely going along, and the coordination effort is still at the nascent stage. So certainly, as Satu pointed out, there probably is a lot of room for better coordination between U.S. and Japan. And you probably noticed that I keep using the word coordination. And then I think that is because my assessment is also that I agree with Satu there, that U.S. and Japan both get so much out of just doing it in a better coordinated way in parallel, as opposed to try to do everything jointly, as a joint U.S.-Japan project. And this is largely because comparative advantage that U.S. and Japan has are quite different, and the defense exchanges that the militaries of the two countries had with the Southeast Asian militaries are also different. Japan has a long history of engaging Southeast Asia for a wide variety of capacity building efforts that sometimes are not very sexy. Sometimes those are about training military medical doctors, or teaching them how to use the heavy equipment to maintain their facilities and equipment. But those are not that tangible, highly visible. But it really does contribute to support the infrastructure of these institutions in Southeast Asia. And U.S. is really pushing this engagement with ASEAN in recent years, especially from the DoD. PACOM has been very aggressive in terms of searching for opportunities for cooperation and engagement, and that is symbolized by the first U.S.-ASEAN Defense Forum in Hawaii that Secretary Hagel hosted before he took off for his own Asia trip that preceded President Obama's own. So there are definitely areas of coordination between Japan's MOD and PACOM, and in the area of ODA, certainly, as Satu mentioned, the JICA and USAID has a large room of coordination and bureaucratic hurdles to go over and try to figure things out. So in short, it should be feasible, but like I said, there are limiting factors. And my perspective on this is a little bit different from Satu's, because my observation comes from, first and foremost, constraints for U.S.-Japan doing more in Southeast Asia may actually lie within ASEAN itself. The reason why I say that is that since its establishment, ASEAN has been quite insistent on one point, which is ASEAN centrality in the order building of the multinational institution in this area. And also the history of the regional institution within the Asia-Pacific region, that ASEAN has played a central role. Unanimous consent or consensus building has been a large part of the effort and one big principle for those institutions. So that actually led to probably ASEAN's inability to support the Philippines in 2012. Specifically, its failure to demonstrate ASEAN-wide decisive diplomatic support for the Philippines, and its failure to offer organizational support as an ASEAN for the Philippines when they had a standoff with the PRC on the Scarborough Shoal. And also, ASEAN has a tradition of rotating its chairmanship by each country, and depending on the who chairs the ASEAN, how to run the series of meetings is, in my observation, fluctuate greatly. So some years it's managed better than the others. So how ASEAN will evolve, as Satu mentioned, they're moving toward the ASEAN community in 2015. How ASEAN as an regional institution will evolve toward that end, I think needs to be closely monitored from this aspect, as after that post-2015, whether ASEAN will continue to, ASEAN will get to the place where it can act as a coherent actor in the sensitive regional security matters that will be concerned to the U.S. and Japan. So that's one point. And the second point that I would like to mention is related to the first point that I just mentioned, is ASEAN's instinct to favor not having to choose between U.S. and Japan alliance and China. And this can also constrain U.S. and Japanese efforts. And I think that there needs to be a sober reality check on both in Washington and in Tokyo, that while ASEAN countries, they definitely appreciate the role that the U.S. plays in the region, Japan plays in the region, and positive effect that the close U.S.-Japan alliance could have in their region, they also are very mindful about how their engagement with U.S. and Japan separately or as an alliance might impact their relations with China. I think that is just a reality that is out there that both countries have to deal with. And lastly, U.S.-Japan also may want to consider evolving other alliance partners. For example, Satu mentioned Australia. Australia has a special ties with Indonesia, so sometimes depending on the area, it's a natural partner to work with. And depending on the other areas, I can't think of anything top of my head, but maybe it is logical to team up with the Australians and South Korea both. So not everything should be solely from a U.S.-Japan alliance prism, but more of a hub and spoke. How does a U.S.-Japan alliance will be the foundation of the inter-alliance cooperation and coordination vis-a-vis Southeast Asia is something that both Tokyo and Washington may want to think about. So really, there is no really silver bullet for how this will make it work. Alliance coordination is hard enough in terms of coordinating each other's bureaucracy. So the more parties there, more bureaucracy to coordinate. So it's just very difficult, despite everyone's good intentions. But this is in my mind very worthwhile effort to try. So to wrap it up, I think there's a lot of potentials in so many areas. But there are some limitations that I think both Japan and U.S. needs to be sober and realistic about as they move forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Yuki. The last point, I just want to pick up on that, and I'm going to open it up to questions here in just a second, so I hope folks will think about what intrigued them most here in these excellent presentations. But I share your skepticism about ASEAN. That's not... I think sometimes skeptics can be mischaracterized as sort of dismissive. I'm not dismissive of ASEAN's role. I'm just skeptical for a lot of the same reasons you mentioned, the restraints on its action, things that are very much embedded in the organization. And I think that especially now with so much attention on ASEAN in Washington, which is great, I'm glad to see a lot of attention, but it has really raised expectations in a way that I'm not sure ASEAN can fulfill, and it's raised them somewhat in a vacuum, that people that don't necessarily appreciate all the restraints. And so, especially among reporters, because reporters come to everything fresh, right? So you get all these photos of people linking hands, the commemorative summit where, for all appearances, it looks like ASEAN is uniting as a part of this common front with the U.S. and Japan. And not just the photos, but the articles are often portrayed that way. And granted, some of us are trying, to do that and are glad that it looks that way. But I wonder, what do you think is really going on? What is ASEAN's real intent? So they all pack up to go to Tokyo for a commemorative event. Happens to occur right after the AIDA's declaration, and they have to sense the way this is going to be spun. If you read the statement doesn't really say anything more than ever, but they must know how this is spun. What are they getting out of this relationship with Japan or with the U.S. or with U.S.-Japan in terms of the geopolitics or any other way? Is that too? You'd be best to probably.
Trying to speak for 10 countries or try to decipher.
Yeah, well, that's another aspect.
That's
of it,
another.
actually.
I think one is that it's a quibble, but the larger point is there is no ASEAN thinking about this. There's Hanoi thinking. I imagine there's Yangon, Naypyidaw thinking. There's certainly Jakarta thinking. And I guess I would frame it this way. Over the last several years, a structural change has occurred in Asia. And that structural change over a decade is the emergence of powers other than Japan at the center of Asia. Where at some point, you can look on a time series and say Japan constituted X percent, 85% of Asia's economy. That is no longer true. That's a good thing. And generally, it's a good thing. So ASEAN is in the center, both in some sense geographically and sort of, across this big Asia. And within Southeast Asia, countries have arisen too. Vietnam started to grow. Indonesia has completed a transition to democracy. Burma is making changes, et cetera, et cetera. So what these countries I interpret as trying to do is, first and foremost, assure their domestic political and economic stability. Therefore, in this changed structural context, they need assistance in whatever way from the US, Japan, China, India, Australia, Korea. As I said, I call it the internationalization strategy. You internationalize by getting a competitive framework of rising powers surrounding Southeast Asia to engage with them for mutual benefit. Vietnam gets something, Korea gets something, US gets something, Australia gets something, countries get something. But the basic notion of ASEAN centrality is built around centrality as a way of preventing excessive claims or demands on sovereignty. Now you can do that two ways. You can resist demands on sovereignty in two ways under international relations. One is to be really strong and just say, sorry, ain't doing it, and be able to say that. Or two, try to just develop some organizational structure and coherence using the weight of comparatively weaker powers to make claims of centrality. So you can say, yes, we want the benefits, but we're only going to go this far because we need consensus. So this is, from my point of view, a built-in limit to ASEAN coherence. It's deliberate. It's constructed. That's fine. Frankly, it's a perfectly sensible strategy to manage what you have. And that's what we have to work with.
Yeah, the fascinating thing for me about that is that that's basically resilience that's been a part of ASEAN since 1967. So now the downside of that, or the cynical way to look at it, is that a lot is changing in the region as you laid out, but ASEAN is not. you know, and that's a problem, and that's a constraint on how much we're going to actually be able to do with them. But let me open it up for questions if there are some. Yes.
Thank you very much for great presentation. My name is Shinichi Sobe with CSIS. I have a question about the trade agreement going on in Asia other than TPP. It's called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's including ASEAN plus 6, Japan, China, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. From U.S. perspective, is this a kind of a threat because U.S. is not included in these trade agreements, or much more positive? It's going to be like a building block toward Asia Pacific wide FTA. And from Japanese perspective, I firmly believe that Japan is in the unique position because Japan is included in both agreements. So maybe Japan can connect these two, TPP and RCEP, and build up a Asia Pacific wide FTA. But what is going to be a major challenge toward the process? I think it may be too early to evaluate, but any comments are appreciated. Thank you very much.
I mean, if you want, I could just mention briefly, and then from just American perspective, I think I don't see it as a threat at all to the United States. I mean, it should be WTO compliant, you know, covering substantially all trade, and in other ways. And if that's the case, I don't really see any problem with it. Our, you know, American companies in the region will be able to take advantage of it and that sort of thing. So, you know, I think in the big geopolitical picture, it will be a little awkward if there is that agreement, but there is no TPP. But, you know, the last couple of years, I'm beginning to lose my faith in geopolitics. I mean, I'm not entirely sure how much of it is just imagination and how much of it is real. I mean, as long as we are there and our companies are doing business and, you know, making a substantial amount of the business there, I'm not sure that makes much difference. I mean, you guys want to add anything?
I fully agree with him that Japan can play a very important bridge role in these two major trading pact we are negotiating, RCEP as well as TPP. TPP may be even higher standard, and the RCEP may try to catch up with TPP, and so more important. Therefore, the Japanese government is trying to negotiate both agreements in parallel. We are not choosing either of these. The TPP we would like to conclude as soon as possible. RCEP, the target is 2015. So I think first it is important for us to show to the region the high standard example by concluding TPP. But at the same time, we, since being in both agreement, we can enlighten the negotiating partners of RCEP based on the experiences of negotiating TPP.
A couple of things. First, we've done two recent things at the East West Center I would draw your attention to. One is a sort of monograph published last week by Peter Petrie, the economist Peter Petrie and Mike Plummer, both economists, who've done a series of very interesting modeling looking at what would happen under RCEP and TPP. The book is called ASEAN Centrality and Integration. Both under TPP and RCEP, and a joint study we did with the Peterson Institute, again using this equilibrium models under different scenarios of TPP membership, TPP 10, TPP 15, TPP 11, etc. The point being that their basic conclusion is that at some point joining these two agreements, trade agreements, that doesn't have to be anytime soon, will lead to gains by FTAP across the Asia Pacific. There'll be two different approaches. One will be high standard, one will be low standard. I am not inclined, I'm not a trade economist, but having looked obviously at both of these reports, read both of these studies, I'm inclined to believe that it is not important which proceeds. I mean, I understand the geopolitics of it. China's out of TPP. I think that's too simple and too easy. The fact is, trade integration is occurring organically, one. Two, in general, from what I understand from people who explain this to me, that trade agreements are not necessarily highly utilized anyway, which is two. And three, whatever supports this supply and production chain integration with either high standards or lesser standards under RCEP will promote gains in the long term, so long as markets are kept open and it's WTO compliant. So on the whole, I think this project of economic integration serves us well. I mean, from a U.S. standpoint, I think TPP would be very, very useful for us. But I don't also think the sky will fall in if it doesn't occur. In other words, as long as U.S. businesses have access to markets and open markets, et cetera, we can continue to be a vital economic player.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, Larry. We got a microphone for you here.
CSIS, focusing on the Philippines for a few seconds. We had a session a couple of months ago at CSIS, and the speaker was a representative from a Boston law firm that is assisting the Philippines in preparing the case that the Philippines is going to present to the Law of the Sea Tribunal, contesting China's claims in the South China Sea. And he described what appears to be a very broad challenge to China's position. A direct challenge to the 9-dash line, a challenge to the idea that controlling any of these little islands and spratlys would give China a right to pronounce an economic zone
Right.
a couple of 100 miles out from any of these islands. And during the question and answer session, I asked him if when the Philippines goes to the LOC, Law of the Sea Treaty Tribunal, and China has refused to participate, by the way, but when the Philippines goes, if third countries can submit opinions to the tribunal, and he said he thought, yes, that third governments could submit opinions on this case to the Law of the Sea Tribunal. I was thinking in asking the question, especially of Japan and Australia, in this regard. So I have a couple of questions here in that context. First of all, do you think it would be useful for Japan specifically to enter a third opinion in this case involving the Philippines and China? Could this have some kind of effect, positive or negative, on the issue of the senkakus between Japan and China if Japan entered this case? And also with regard to the U.S., and I guess I'll ask Satu and Walter specifically on this one, does the fact that the U.S. not adhering to the Law of the Sea Tribunal, and I understand there is a big debate going on and has been for a long time in this country, but those big issues aside, does U.S. non-adherence to the LOC treaty, which I assume would keep the U.S. from entering a third opinion, a third country opinion in this case, but does it overall weaken our ability to influence the situation in the South China Sea? Is this a weakening effect specifically related to this situation of not adhering to the treaty?
All right. Yamada-san, you want to take that first?
I am not familiar with the legal validity or the possibility of submitting third-party opinion, and I do appreciate you are sharing with us the lawyers' views. But one point I would like to mention very clearly here is it is the Japan and the United States, basically these two countries only, which strongly stated support for the Philippines' submission of memorials a couple of weeks ago. And Japan and the United States, as I said in my opening remarks, made it very clear in the joint statement our strong support for taking arbitration measures as a rule-based trial for rule-based resolution to the case. So that strong support, without handing in third-party opinion, the two countries are already taking very clear steps on that issue. But specifically on that third-party opinion, I have to look.
Yeah, I think, you know, the frustration, one of the frustrations I have with ASEAN is that ASEAN is not taking a position on it. And I don't mean on the Philippine claim, because they have their own, their member countries have their own conflicting claims, but on the process and on the Philippines availing itself of a process that ASEAN has said should be a part of the solution now for 20 years. So that kind of mystifies me. It's not just ASEAN itself, it's the member countries as well have been very, I don't know, tepid would be too strong a word. They've not really said anything in support of the Philippines availing themselves of the arbitration panel. On UNCLOS, I mean, you know, Satu, I'll let Satu speak because he may have a different opinion, but I think it's of marginal value. I mean, the U.S. position on UNCLOS, I mean, because the U.S. adheres to all of the maritime provisions of the treaty as a matter of customary international law. China is a signatory to the treaty. The Philippines is a signatory to the treaty. The other ASEAN countries, Japan, and it doesn't seem to be having any impact so far on the resolution of it or even the management of it. So I'm not sure what good it would do the United States to sign up or you know, to ratify. I don't see what kind of effect it could have. Maybe, again, I'll allow there could be some marginal PR impact. But in the long run, if the Chinese are going to ignore whatever the arbitration panel comes out with, I don't think the U.S. being a part of it would make a difference on that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting point, Larry, about third parties joining the case. It's interesting. I don't know, obviously, as not an international lawyer, so what the rules are, because we're not, at least maybe in domestic politics, we would say, look, you know, have standing in the case. I'm not sure under international law whether, since it's a territorial dispute between two countries, and you're talking about U.S. and Japan joining, whether in international law that
Sorry, but it wouldn't technically be a territorial dispute.
Oh, I see. It would be more about
a matter of law, interpretation of the law.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and
How the law of the sea
applies to it.
Which is, I think, the heart of the Philippine case.
The large on UNCLOS, you know, I end up at the same place Walter does, but I would still say that the overall benefits. I said at the beginning that I think there is a great struggle in Asia for balance of power, balance of order, and balance of relations. And on order, the more we can do to embed an international order, which the U.S. has been heavily influential in devising, helps us to lay a foundation for the rule and norm-based approach. And therefore, I think that the gains of signing it are there. Let me be very clear, whatever other, and I've tried to understand other reasons why people have hesitation and caution about signing it, mining and all kinds of other issues. I end up at the same place as Walter, as I said, because I don't think our signing and, ratifying will lead to a change in Chinese behavior. or a resolution of the dispute. But I don't think we should see the instrumentality of ratifying UNCLOS only on the basis of resolving those disputes. I think it's important for the U.S. to be seen as ratifying a rules-based order that it has helped to devise, even if it's imperfect.
You know, just one quick anecdotal point is that yesterday we had a panel discussion here with Eli Ratner from CNAS and John Odom from OSD, and a couple of our experts, Steve Groves, who's an international lawyer and expert on law of the sea, and Dean Cheng. And a good participation in the audience, including a lot of Chinese reporters and otherwise similar representatives. Right, but, and you know, it didn't come up. The issue didn't come up at all. I mean, it's just anecdotal, but we had an hour and a half, and nobody raised the matter of the utility of the U.S. joining UNCLOS. And again, it's anecdotal, but it makes me think, you know, sort of combined with other little data points here and there, that to a great degree, Washington has moved beyond that. Now, it might come back, but I mean, a couple of years ago, it was very much a front burner thing. Everybody was talking about it. Anytime you had a gathering like this, someone would ask that question, or more than that, someone wouldn't ask. They would assert, you know, very strongly that we have to join in order to, you know, but you just don't hear it as much. I don't, maybe Washington now has just sort of discounted the odds of it happening anytime sooner, and trying to, you know, create alternative scenarios or work through different ways to find common ground, but you know, just an impression.
Can I just
Yeah.
add 2 cents? So like Minister Yamada said, Japan specifically entering the third-party opinion, I think it needs to be carefully considered within the Japanese government for its potential impact on the East China Sea, on its potential impact of Chinese reaction, not only to specifically to that, but you know, by Japanese action of doing so, and how they may able to take, you know, they're taking their frustration out in East China Sea area, their behavior in East China Sea. I think those kind of elements needs to be calculated out. But I think one thing that I could possibly see is kind of related to the frustration that Walter mentioned, that there is really no, you know, support from other Southeast Asian countries about, you know, supporting Philippines, not about the substance of the claim, but about the process. That what, you know, Philippines' argument is that, you know, there needs to be a process that manage these disputes, and then I think that's where Japan and U.S. can play a little bit of a role, seeking it out with each country in Southeast Asia about how come are you not, you know, more overt in your support. This is not about the specific claim, but it's more about the process. And the process that Philippines try to put out there for arbitration is something that you all have said in the past that's more desirable. So that may be the area where U.S. and Japan, without, you know, we ourselves putting in our own opinion about it to the court, may be able to work something out.
President Obama could raise this in Malaysia specifically.
For
Yeah,
example,
right,
yes.
yeah.
Lines of what you're suggesting.
That's a great point.
That's a good example. Yeah. Let me just come back to a point that Yuki made some time ago, and then Yamada-san may also have a perspective on this. But you mentioned a code of conduct in Japan's role. What exactly, well, is Japan's role and channels for impacting the negotiations, if you want to call them that? They're actually, I think, officially called consultations between China and ASEAN on code of conduct. And what could it be? I mean, how are you looking out for Japanese interests in the way that develops? Because you do have a major interest in how that comes out for its application in South China Sea, but also how it will work elsewhere. How do you see it? And then Yamada-san.
All right.
I'll go first.
First of all, as I said in my opening statement, South China Sea is very important from our point of view. Firstly, because that is in the middle of sea lanes of communications, but secondly, because that is an area where we can set international standard to solve these difficult issues. And that code of conduct, of course, we are not a member or the party to the consultations, but because of the heightened tensions we think it's very important to expedite the process of negotiation or the consultations. And it is, to some extent, to us, it seems the pressure was eased after China officially agreeing to consult on the code of conduct last summer. But the important thing is not just consult, as you use the word negotiate. I think the important thing is the members directly involved start official negotiation as soon as possible and and establish rules that will ensure the stability in the region. So we, Japan and the United States, are encouraging the Southeast Asian countries to enter into negotiation as soon as possible. Therefore, the joint statement also mentions the quick resolution of the or conclusion of code of conduct. And we, the Japanese side, thinks that it will be effective if the code of conduct has a legally binding nature. But that's up to the Southeast Asian countries, and as you said, whether legally bound or not may not be the ultimate importance. If a more important thing is the parties who agree to that code of conduct will honor that code of conduct. So we will continue to encourage Southeast Asian countries as well as China to start real negotiation rather than not satisfying with consultations.
Okay. Let me just one clarification. You used the phrase directly involved, the country's directly involved. That's language that the Chinese use, and actually, unfortunately, they take it out of the 2002 Declaration of Conduct, but they use it to imply that ASEAN is not the main player here, that if you just leave us alone with the Philippines and Malaysia, you don't mean that, right?
No,
I mean, you
no.
mean the broader...
Yes,
Yeah.
so ASEAN as a group with China to start negotiating this code of conduct is important.
Okay. Yuki?
From my perspective, obviously there are specific elements that code of conduct, which will be ultimately negotiated and agreed upon, that Japan would like to see, and that is really first and foremost is a norm setting. That there's territorial sovereignty claims amongst the different parties or disagreements over sovereignty issues. That is something that needs to be addressed diplomatically, and in the meantime, there needs to be a certain process that needs to be put in place to manage the risk of miscalculation, manage of accidents, and tension easing. So I think those are a couple of elements that I think Japan would definitely have an interest in seeing in an ultimate outcome of the Code of Conduct. And then I think by continuing to support Southeast Asia to enter the negotiation of this Code of Conduct, and also strongly urge China to do so, that'll give also Japan an opening to engage China on the, as you know, Walter, Japan and China does have bilateral maritime issue consultation frameworks. So as the Code of Conduct consultation and hopefully negotiation soon will proceed, it gives Japan a little bit more strength in engaging China in those maritime consultation framework about not exactly the identical code of conduct, but the similar urging China to work with Japan to establish a similar, tension management, crisis management mechanism.
But do you have, are there any worries that the negotiations could come out in a way that's detrimental to Japan? I mean, I can just think of one way it could come out detrimental to the U.S., that is if, the Chinese and there are several other countries in ASEAN who agree that there should be notification of military activities in EEZs, just a small thing. And I don't know that it's a topic of discussion in this, but it's an example of how it could come out in a bad way. And do the Japanese have a way of channeling into the discussions to protect things of that nature?
We do. The answer is yes. We have very close communications with the ASEAN countries, and we also raise this issue or discuss the code of conduct in the expanded maritime ASEAN Maritime Forum. Yes, and that's not only by the government officials but also second track people. So it's 1.5 track where it is easier to have more in-depth discussions on ongoing discussions on the fast track. So yes, we do have various channels to make our input into the consultations or negotiations, and we will continue to keep ASEAN countries informed of our view of their consultations.
Well, I think we have to leave the discussion there. I want to thank you guys for coming out. I really appreciate it. Yamada-san in particular, to give us the presence of the Japanese official here so quickly on the heels of success in your Tokyo meetings. Congratulations on that, and thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.